Welcome back, BrainWise friends, to segment 3 of our continued conversation on the art and science of effective dialogue, specifically where we are talking about how to ask great open-ended questions and tell or share our perspective in a conversation. Today's episode is going to be all around the TAPS model: tell, ask, problem, and solution, a practical tool you can use in all of your dialogues or conversations to help make them, and specifically help make you, a more effective communicator. If you've enjoyed this series, comment, share, or subscribe so that others can find us and become a part of our growing BrainWise community. So far, we've shared a lot around the balance between asking and telling information. We've talked a little bit about great open-ended questions, but let's talk a little bit about maybe some practical application outside of the tips that we've talked about thus far and shared with our BrainWise friends. You've always called it the TAPS model, or tell, ask, problem, solution. Let's spend the next 15, 20 minutes talking about that particular model and how one can use it successfully when having dialogue, whether at home, at work, with friends, boss, employee, the gambit of all conversations. How does it help us?
It helps by so one of the things, I think we said this before, that the difference between a novice and an expert is a model. And it's pretty well true for everything. We gave a model just now of how to reach balance. Look at whether you're high tell, high ask. We can take that ask tell thing in a slightly different way. So if you imagine asking and telling being opposite ends of the vertical scale, right? And on the left-hand side, you've got problem orientation. And on the right-hand side, you've got solution orientation. So that gives us 4 quadrants to look at. Again, same 2x2 matrix. Top left-hand quadrant is asking about problems.
Okay.
The top right quadrant is asking about solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we go bottom, we got the bottom left is telling about problems. And then the bottom right is telling about solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And what our brains tend to do is start off asking about the situation.
Right.
Right? In fact, Ralph Waldo Emerson did this really well, as I understand it. He wouldn't, when he met somebody that he knew, he wouldn't say, "How are you?" He'd say, "What seems clearer now?" It's a great open-ended question, which cuts out all the noise, the noise and the immaterial stuff to get some really interesting. So asking about what the situation. Then what we tend to do is drop down to verification. And we even talk about this in our dialogue. We drop down, what I understand, so your problem is what I understand. We're actually telling for confirmation what's going on. Once we've got our arms around, yes, that's the problem, that's what we're dealing with, we tend, especially in the Western world, to then hop across from the bottom left to the bottom right and say, "Here's your solution.
I have the magic cure."
Aren't I smart? Aren't I right? Aren't I correct? Aren't I in control? Whatever it might be, and the brain tends to reward us by going, "Oh my gosh, those once or twice when I've been right, I get a reward, a little hit of dopamine in the brain, and therefore I'm going to continue doing it." All right. What you now notice, if you were to draw this on a diagram, is that you've come down the left-hand side, you've gone across the bottom, you never attended anything in the top right-hand quadrant. And that's what we call the sweet spot, all right, where you start asking questions about the solution.
Right. And about how they can solve it, not necessarily.
Absolutely. And so if you are, especially if you're in a coaching mode or you're in a developmental mode at work, you've got you're a supervisor and you're helping somebody who works for you has come and said, "What do you think about this?" Turns out the data says something like 85% of the time when somebody says to you, "How do I solve this?" or "Can you help me solve this?" or whatever it might be, 85% of the time, they actually have an idea on what should be done. Maybe they don't have the courage to come up with it. Maybe there's been slapped around before for not coming up with the right idea. And so what they're looking for is support or affirmation or whatever it might be. Your job as coach or developer is to help people actually explore it for themselves.
Right.
So if you work on that principle that 5 times out of 6, roughly speaking, that individual has got a good idea, at least something that might work. So your job is to dig it out. And that can be, what have you already thought of? What have you thought of? Where have you seen something like this in the past? What other things seem to work in parallel? What have you thought of and dismissed? What have you already tried?
Right.
I can keep on going for probably an hour with that question. We don't tend to practice those open-ended questions. And if you want to try something new and you're playing golf or you're playing tennis or you're any sport, you will go and practice it. Exactly the same as when you're trying to learn a new technique like this, practice it. And look at how much time you spend in asking open-ended questions versus telling what's going on.
Exactly. And I think you can identify in a way to help you is if there's someone on your team, in particular at work anyways, that you trust and feel comfortable, is ask for an accountability partner and say, I'm working on balancing and actually asking for the solution versus always telling how to solve it. If I get off kilter, or help me understand where I'm at, right, along the journey, because they can give you a cue or a sign during dialogue or in a reflection moment. You're doing really well. I'm starting to see a better balance, or you're reverting to X or whatever it might be, because it'll allow you to get some instantaneous feedback. And I think another reason, Phil, that dawned on me is that we want to ask for the solution is that's where the most rich learning happens.
Yeah.
When I get to think about it and when I get to come up with the solution and then therefore share it, I'm going to go, wait a minute. And also ownership.
Yeah. And so a couple of things happen in our brain. So let's step back and go, what's going on in our brain? And that is, if you can get to that point where you're asking somebody to come up with their ideas and they explore. And by the way, if you're not 100% trusted, you can still use this, because what's going to happen is people will come up with, give you an idea. I think we could do X. They may not feel comfortable giving you their true idea, because they're testing you out a little bit. So quite often the first idea will come out, will say,
Right.
I think we should paint the wall red. Okay, great. Now ask more. You can either drill down or ask we do. And it's those what else could we do or could you do? When you get to the second, third, or maybe fourth answer, that's where something of richness is coming out.
Right.
Because now they're digging deeper, or they're getting to the point where they trust you a little more. And they'll tell you some of the maybe riskier versions of. And so don't ever just stand there and take the first one and go, great, let's move.
And if their response is, I don't know, right? Like the person responds, there is a point where we do then need to tell, because maybe they truly don't know. But one of the questions, especially for coaches or supervisor relationships, that I have always suggested is, because it's positive direction, it's saying, if you did know, what would you do?
Yeah.
Because now I'm putting you in this space of assuming that you know the answer, right? And I always believe that 90% of the time, human beings have the answers they lie within. We just need someone to help us facilitate it out, right?
Yeah.
And so by asking that particular question of the individual, it puts their brain in a more positive frame of reference to say, okay, I do know. What would I do? Now, if they respond to that question and say, I still don't know, that's probably your opportunity now to switch back to, let me share a little bit more around X, maybe not give the full answer, but then say, now based off of that, what do you think you would do?
Yeah. And so that's what we would have. If somebody says, I truly don't know, and if you ask me another open-ended question, I'm going to have to slap you.
Right.
There is a point in time when people don't know, and that's why they've come to you. But then what I would recommend is exactly what you said, and I call it getting permission to drop down. And that is, hey, is now a good time for me? I've had some experience in here. I know a couple of things that might work. Is now a good time? So you actually just check in with somebody, because if they then say yes, now you have a charter to say, okay.
Right.
And if you possibly can, don't just give one answer, because that is an experience of me feeling told what to do. If you can give two, or better even still three possibilities, hey, I've seen this work in the past, I've seen this.
Right.
Now you go, that's your bottom right-hand quadrant. Now go back up to which of those three seems most appropriate in this situation.
Right. 100%.
Because what that does is it gives the recipient's brain a sense that I'm still in control. You haven't told me what to do.
Exactly. And I think, Phil, one of the things that people might be going, how do I adapt this to a relational context? Like if I'm talking with my spouse, because some of those questions I would probably personally avoid asking my husband for good reasons. But I think depending on the context, you can use the same frame of reference, but instead of it being, okay, what would you do? It could be one of the things I've always described to people, even in outside of relationships, but in marriages specifically too, is the problem that we're trying to solve. Let's take it and put it on the chair so that the problem is in front of us. And now we're going to solve the problem together. And so instead of saying, what would you do? Or why didn't you do this? Or how could, because that it creates some distance. It's what have we tried? Now, in a boss relationship, we advise staying away from we because it creates joint accountability for the solution when we need the other person to own it, right? But in marriage, oftentimes, now, if it's something I personally need to work on, then I need to own up to that. But if there's a financial situation that we need to solve, right, we both can have ownership in that. Maybe I need to do a better job of communicating my spending or vice versa. But we can solve that together and saying, okay, we have a financial challenge we need to solve. What have we done in the past that's worked? What have we not tried that we think we could try? And now it becomes a collaborative session focused on the problem that's in the chair. And I think that's critical in these dialogues because a lot of times those are the conversations around finance, intimacy, other things that become very heated and can sometimes get a bit out of whack in terms of where we want the conversation to go. And it's a lot of times because the emotions, I know because a lot of times they're mine, there's things that are crossing all over the place. But if you actually physically talk about the problem is here and that's what we're solving in this chair, it makes it less about you and less about me and how that is going versus that's the problem. Now let's solve it together.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if we step back and become aware of where we are in one of those four quadrants and what's most appropriate next.
Yeah.
I've just found that model. I didn't to give credit that I first came across that in a book by David Rock called Quiet Leadership. And I've used that many times since.
I love it.
And that question you asked about, if you did know, what would you do, is a single most powerful question. And I saw that in an operation probably 30 years ago. There's a guy called Tim Galway, who was a professional tennis coach. And he would say to people, what's the biggest issue you have? And they would say, I don't know, serving or backhand or whatever it might be. And he'd ask the question as they were playing, if you did know, what would you do? And they go, oh, I'd do it this way, bang. And so it works both for intellectual, cognitive skills, and it seems like it works for motor skills as well.
I love it. I think it's really good. I think we've shared a lot of good, rich context and also BrainWise tips along this journey, Phil, for all of our BrainWise friends on how do we have a more effective dialogue and really diving into the art and science of effective communication. And I think we're always going to be constant learners, life learners, and evolving this because even in relationships, when you've been married to someone for a number of years, we all are changing every day as human beings. And so we need to remain curious, continue to get to know our spouse. And so how we communicated a couple of years ago may not be the way we need to communicate with them today. Same thing at work. You might have worked with somebody for a number of years and they're changing too. And you have new people being introduced. And so how are you constantly learning to communicate more effectively with those that are around you? Because ultimately you're going to get a better outcome if you focus on how can I show up better in these dialogues. I think, Phil, how would you Before we go to our BrainWise moments from the week, or unwise perhaps, because those are always fun to talk about, how would you summarize what we've talked about today? I'll give a few reflection questions for folks, and then we'll have a little fun to end our episode today and go through our BrainWise or unwise moments.
So I think probably pick one of the models that we've talked about and just visualize it. Or if anybody wants to have a document that we send, happy to send them and share the documents that we have around this. Become aware of where you are at any point in time and what is your intent to do next. And then do you have one of these tools to actually make it more effective? I'd say those three things.
I love it. Yeah, no, I think it's great. And a couple of our reflection questions to add on to that today on how we might be able to use this from our listeners' perspective is, when do I feel safest to speak and when do I shut down? What emotion drives my urge to tell rather than ask? How can I use curiosity to diffuse my next conflict? That's a really interesting question, actually. Who in my life needs me to pause more before responding? And how can I show support even when I disagree? Which is extremely difficult sometimes to do, but so important, especially in relationships. So pick one of those questions, pick one of our models that we talked about today, as Phil was describing, and where is it that you can begin to use that information to help you improve along this journey? So Phil, before we end the episode, let's talk about our brain wise or our brain unwise moments from the week. And I'll go ahead and share because mine just happened today, in fact. So I guess this is a reward moment for me, but over the last I'm a baker, for those who don't know, and I enjoy sourdough baking. I enjoy regular baking, bread, cookies, cakes, pies, the whole gambit of it all. And I thoroughly enjoy doing it. Now, I also have to be careful how much I do it because I can't eat it all or I'll be as big as a hippopotamus. So that's number one. That's a brain-wise moment or tip for myself, is don't eat it all. But over the last number of probably about 12, maybe 16 months, I have been making bread in a bread maker as well as making it in like a sourdough. I've been able to make traditional classic white bread in my bread maker, no problem. But I've had a really difficult time making whole wheat bread in the bread maker. It always falls when it goes to the baking part. It does a great job with rising. It rises really high and all of this. And I think it was related to my hydration level in terms of how much moisture. Well, today I successfully made a loaf of whole wheat bread that did not fall. So now the true test will come in. How does it taste? Because it's a little bit different recipe, but I'm sure it'll be fabulous. But it rose, it didn't fall, it looks beautiful, it smells delicious in here, so I can't wait to cut it open at lunchtime and have a little piece of bread. But that's my brain-wise moment. I did something fun this morning, and I learned how to finally make a whole wheat loaf of bread without it falling.
Congratulations. And I look forward to one of these days coming down, tasting it, because I do like regular, good old bread and butter.
I do too. I've got some for you whenever you're ready.
You got it. So my brain-wise moment occurred actually on Saturday.
Okay.
And that is, some things happened and I arrived back home Kathy's been away all week, and I arrived home back on Saturday and I didn't have the ingredients planned for my dinner. And so I had to look in what was available. We still don't have a refrigerator that works yet. The pickings were small, but what I did find was some frozen ground beef and an onion and a potato. And I went, what has to happen to make dinner out of these three things?
You are resourceful.
And so what I said to myself, and Kathy reminded me, she said, so what you had was just burger and chips in a slightly different fashion. And that was exactly right. I ground up the beef, put some onion in, did that, cut up the potato, made some mashed potato. And so I had ground beef and onion on mashed potato. It was a perfect, satisfactory dinner, probably even improved slightly more by some good old 2017 Zinfandel.
I love it. That sounds delicious, very resourceful also. Very good. BrainWise friends, we're so glad you continue to go on this journey with us. We hope to see you next week as we continue on our dialogue of decoding our life through the lens of neuroscience and a little bit of behavioral science sprinkled in. Join us on Thursday for our Neuroscience Digest episode. We've got a lot in store for you. And until then, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay brainwise.